Now we have logical use of ideas supporting imaginative play and negotiating and problem solving with the world, having debates, having problem solving discussions at the symbolic level. So these are our 6 functional levels. And for each level, we can look at the particular motor skills and language skills and visual spatial processing skills that relate to that level, that are needed to support that level. And this gives us a much more integrated roadmap of development. So when we see a child now, we can figure out where they are in their functional level. So these 3 new insights also correlate very nicely with insights about the neurophysiology and the neuroanatomy and neurochemistry of the brain. Because interestingly, as we've done more brain imaging studies and more basic research from animal work, we know more than ever before that relationships and interactions and appropriate levels of stimulation is important for proper brain growth, not just mind growth. And also, interestingly, the stages of these functional stages we're talking about correlate nicely with how the brain gets myelinated. So, for example, at around 8 to 12 months, the prefrontal cortex is becoming more and more myelinated. And that's the point at which purposeful interactions are gaining ascendancy and gaining strength. And the child can now motor plan well enough to reach for something, take it, hand it back. And it's just the time that the areas of the brain that allow that to happen are beginning to myelinate. So while we can't say that the relationship and the interaction stimulates brain growth, we do know, though, that when we deprive children of these interactions, the brain growth doesn't occur. Well, we can't say one stimulates the other, but they seem to occur right at the same time in optimal or ideal development. And what's been missed for a long time with our research colleagues in neuroscience, it's often been assumed that the environment operates like a little switch. Oh, language will come in if you just turn on the switch. In other words, you can't deprive a child entirely, you just have to give them a little bit of environmental nourishment, but any kind will do in any sort of family situation. From our work with children with autism and other developmental problems, we see that that doesn't happen with children with challenges, that they need very specialized environments. And there's a reason why children start talking with therapy or with a proper home program. Well, I think what the original observers ignored was the fact that in many of the families where there are not developmental challenges, these interactive patterns that support these 6 functional levels, engagement, interaction, signaling, problem solving, use of language in an imaginative and functional way, these things are happening automatically. And so they're taken for granted. And they're subsumed under the notion of just broad environmental support. There hasn't been awareness that the environmental support that supports proper brain growth is most likely very specific and supports each of these 6 functional areas. We see it in the children with special needs, and we see it also in children at environmental risk, where the environments are just very unavailable, very withholding and very overstimulating. The children don't develop proper language, cognition, or emotional and social skills. And in normal development, where these things are developing, all these things are in place. The parents are supporting engagement and regulation and two-way communication and problem solving and creative use of ideas. So my hypothesis would be that the environment actually provides just as specific nutriments to the proper growth of the brain that our internal biology provides in terms of proper enzymes and proper biological pathways, that both have to be in place, the biological substrate and the experiential environmental. And the experiential environmental is much more specific than we ever realized before, and I think we've got a handle now on this roadmap that we can apply, and we have been applying to children with special needs, and we've seen it at least at a clinical level and a case study level and a systematic study of cases, children doing better than we ever expected when we apply this model. So we've been able to help children with severe language problems learn to speak if we first get them engaged and get them purposeful in their gestures, and then we build in the symbolic speaking and thinking capacities. If we try to do the speaking and thinking without the foundation pieces, without these early levels, it doesn't go as well. They have a bunch of splinter skills. So this, I think, tells us that this roadmap is very, very important. So this all translates, these new research and new insights translates into what we call a DIR model, which just summarizes these 3 areas of insight. D for functional developmental levels. We want to see where the child is in their development. I for individual differences in processing. What's their processing profile in terms of auditory processing, visual spatial, sensory modulation, motor planning. And R, what are their relationships like? What is the interactive use of affects like in the family now? And what would be the ideal pattern to support enhanced development? And what is the pattern we want in the therapeutic program at home and at school to support enhanced development? So this is why we call it a DIR model, because it looks comprehensively at the child. And it's an advance over the older ways of thinking, because we're not just focused on isolated cognitive skills, and we're not just focused on surface behaviors. We're focused on integrated understanding of human development from the point of view of interaction with the environment, internal biologically mediated processing differences, and the child's developmental roadmap in terms of determining where the child is. Now, as you and I have discussed many times, this now changes the way we do assessments and the way we plan interventions. Do you want to comment on how this has altered the way we approach the assessment process?
Well, one of the things I think we observed that often assessments were done based on these older views. Let's look at the speech milestones. Let's look at the motor milestones. Let's look at cognitive milestones. And children who actually had underlying difficulties that interfered with the ability to perform were being put through these formalized assessments. And that didn't really help you understand the child and how the child functions as a whole. So in our view, what we would do is really first look at how the child functions. And we want to see that functioning within those relationships that are most important with for the child and with the people that he knows best. So we want to see the child interacting spontaneously with his mother, his father, other important caregivers. And that begins to give us the first picture of all these developmental capacities, because as you say, they are actually all functional at the same time. So by first making sure we have enough opportunity to observe a child and the family interacting, and to take the time to do that, to do it several times so that we really can cover the range, depending on what kind of day it might be, we're going to look at these interactive capacities and see, what does the child initiate? How does the parent respond? What does it take to have shared attention? How much back and forth is there? Is it embedded in pleasure or protest? Or we might see other things, that the child might be more avoidant or unresponsive or underreactive. And it gives us a chance to see what the child's solutions have been, because we know there are underlying issues that may be interfering the automatic development as we typically see it. And we can begin to raise questions in our mind. Okay, why is this happening? Parents try to find solutions to engage their children. Children find solutions to dealing with the world around them. And by examining this open-ended observation, we have our best chance of looking at where things are and a chance to see what we can do to facilitate more effective engagement, get more shared attention, do the problem solving. And we can look at each of the levels. So our assessment approach is one, to observe what's there, and then to see what will facilitate this happening. And that's where the intervention actually begins. It's in the assessment process. Now, we may have questions about some of these individual differences that you outlined, and there we may go to a more formal type of an assessment to establish a baseline. Let's look at auditory processing. Let's look at visual spatial processing. What is the motor planning like? And that will give us not only an assessment, but also, again, a chance to think of how much specific therapy the child might benefit from, and how to make that therapy, again, an interactive process for the child. So in each of these components, we're going to look at the functional capacities at each level. We'll look at some of the individual differences and perhaps bring in an assessment if we have questions about that area that aren't answered through the spontaneous observation. And then we'll put that into the context of the family and the relationship. So when we take a history, we don't only want to know when the child sat up or crawled or pointed, all of which are very important for understanding motor planning, but we want to understand how the child related and whether they followed cues and what kind of baby. And we'll often hear parents say they were such an easy baby, and that really may have been a very underreactive baby that didn't make demands, that didn't take in the world readily, but was easy, so to speak. Similarly, we might find it was a very fussy and sensitive and irritable child that was hard to soothe and hard to calm. So we take the history with the same perspective of looking at how that child was growing, to the point that we meet them and see how they adapted, how they coped, what the family had to do to support that development. And that helps us understand where development might have been derailed or at what point, what else might have happened. So we want an understanding of the family, the history within the family, the relationships in the family, and how that child, what the world was like for this child in terms of the world he lives in and the parents live in. And that begins the process of thinking about how we can support this child and family better.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting important elements of the assessment process. And just to systematize it a little bit, when we conduct an assessment in this new way, we always start off with, as you point out, observations of the child and the caregivers interacting with one another. And so watching and observing and even doing a little coaching for at least a half hour to 45 minutes, and hopefully doing it on more than one occasion, so you see the child at different times, is a cornerstone. And when we do this observation, we're in our own minds figuring out what the child's functional developmental capacities are, how well do they attend, engage, gesture purposefully, problem solve by using many gestures together, use ideas creatively or use ideas logically. We're seeing where they are in their developmental hierarchy. And then we're also observing their processing capacities. How well do they find things in visual spatial? How well do they follow directions or listen or understand? Auditory processing. How well do they speak in terms of expressive language? How well do they sequence and plan their motor actions? Are they overreactive every time mommy comes near? Are they instead craving and bunking into everyone,
right,
trying to get more sensory? Or are they underreactive and self-absorbing? So we're observing the sensory profile and the motor planning. We're observing their functional developmental level. And then we're observing what the caregivers and the therapist's natural inclinations are in working with this. Are they overstimulating the tactile sensitive child? Or are they under-energizing with the child who's underreactive, not engaging enough, not wooing enough? So we observe these patterns, and this is the beginning of the assessment process. Then as part of that, we do the history, and we go back to the beginning of the baby's life, often prenatally, so we want to know about health and nutrition and general status. And we monitor, after the baby is born, after we do the prenatal history, the child's mastery of each functional stage and find out what their processing profile looked like at each stage of their development up to the present. So now we have a roadmap of their development up till present. And then a very important component is sitting down and talking with the family, with mommy and daddy about their relationship in terms of their marriage, in terms of the relationship with other children and siblings in the family, and the dynamics of the family patterns, as well as the dynamics of the relationship with a child who has the challenges. And so we see the child's challenges now embedded in a larger family pattern, and sometimes there may be